Welcome to Supply Chain Next with your host, Richard Donaldson. Join us as we explore the ongoing evolution of supply chain, from the challenges professionals face every day to the ongoing digital transformation of the entire value network.
Welcome to the next episode of Supply Chain Next, and I am thrilled here to have Jason Breault. Am I saying that?
Breault.
Breault. Oh gosh, okay. You got all the silent syllables in there. So Breault, yeah. Got it. Apologize. So Jason Breault from the East Coast here today, and we're going to dive into in a second. Welcome, Jason, to the show.
Hey, appreciate it. Thanks, Richard.
Absolutely. And so just like everything else, we're going to jump right into it. And like everyone here who's listening and wants to learn a little bit about Jason, tell everyone a little bit about your origin story, kind of how you got to sort of where you're at.
Boy, how far back do you want to go?
Well, but you say that kiddingly, but honestly, for a lot of people listening who might be coming just out of college or even thinking about transitioning into supply chain, don't feel like going back as far as you want to go, quite frankly.
Yeah, it's interesting to me because I speak with a lot of folks on a daily basis where their roots, I'll say their college roots, mean something, whereas there's just as many where they've completely deviated from their origin. But in my case, I think it does play a part. Mm-hmm. I actually went to school at the University of Rhode Island, and went in the early stages of them introducing a new program. It was a 5-year bachelor's program in engineering and German.
Oh.
And
of course, Germanic engineering. Why not? Right?
Exactly. Right. This is 1990.
Right. Okay.
At the time, and their focus was, not only giving you the engineering. So I went for electrical engineering, got an electrical engineering degree, but then speaking German as well. So all of your internships were done in Germany, an opportunity to live over there, and all of that. So that was pretty cool, and an opportunity to come out with that degree. And the focus at the time, my focus going in with a lot of guidance from my father, who, for me, I still consider to be the best mentor I've ever had.
Awesome.
Was really, think back to 1990, tech was not as big as it is today, right? Today, tech is inherent in every child growing up. At the time, you needed to be a little bit more intentional about it. So my goal going into school, I was a horrible engineer. Richard, I realized that in one of my internships where I created smoke by touching two of the wrong wires together, everybody else got really excited. I'm like, if this is the height of excitement, this is not for me. But I went in with intention, with the goal of being able to learn to speak like a technologist, like an engineer, with a goal of getting into sales and marketing at the time.
Okay.
And interestingly enough, I came out of school, and my focus at the time was to go after pre-internet.
Yeah, right.
To go to the German embassy in New York City, and I ordered 2 books, $100 each at the time. One book was a list of all of the German-based companies that have offices here in the States. Oh. And the second book was all US-based companies that have offices in Germany. And I literally sent out applications to about 200 to 250 of those. Cherry-picked some certain ones, mostly larger organizations. And I didn't necessarily know what I was going to do with it, but I knew I wanted to somehow leverage the German aspect because I really enjoyed the communication and I felt like I had a lot to offer. And somehow the engineering side. So I really focused on applying to technology-oriented companies and landed with Siemens. Mm-hmm. And although most people know Siemens as the large manufacturing business, for me, it seems lately more often nowadays, the medical side, I see the logos everywhere. When I, hit the big 5-0 last week, and started, the more aches and pains you have, the more Siemens you see, right? But all kidding aside, I actually worked for a division of theirs that was just starting up literally on day one in the US, doing SAP implementations.
Right.
Back in the early 90s, Siemens was considered one of the largest customer of SAP. And they had, basically created a couple thousand people that knew the software so well that if they didn't leverage them somehow, they were going to lose them. So they created a consulting practice that rivaled the big 6 at the time. And Europe had actually competed strongly with them. So what happened was all of these companies, when they rolled out SAP overseas, said, listen, we want to roll this out to the States now. Who in Siemens can we talk to over there? And for years, they were left scratching their heads because they didn't have an establishment here. So they started up an SAP consulting practice. I was the marketing grunt in the practice. And over the course of 6 years, went through a training program that was partly in marketing, that actually got certified in implementing the SAP modules, production planning specifically. It's got a lot of great exposure to the manufacturing and operations floor, and then leveraged that through another mentor, a great mentor that I had over there by the name of Andy Chu, to help me get into sales. And my specialty became working with those sales reps overseas, Germany, Austria, and Switzerland. I'd go over there almost monthly to figure out who had projects that were about to wrap up that they wanted to take to the States so that we could negotiate a deal, an SAP consulting engagement, before anyone else in the States even knew there was a deal to be had. So that became my specialty, sort of bridging that gap, right? Because when these projects became more complex than everyone thought. Because originally, everyone in Europe thought, hey, we're just going to roll this out. We're just going to slam this down the throats of some people in the States. When in reality, there was a cultural barrier that needed to be overcome together with business differences. So my specialty became, from a sales standpoint, really kind of bringing the two customer sites together, the US and the European customer together, to realize, hey, let's talk about what your goals are, and you need to trust us that we'll help you get there.
Right. So let me jump in for a quick second, because I don't want to lose sight of this. But I mean, first of all, I wasn't even thinking about the connection point. You know, I even looked at your CV and everything, and I saw Siemens in there, and I saw the SAP practice. So of course, my immediate start to thinking about, you know, clearly this is the entree into supply chain. But just to put it into context, the time frame we're talking about here is about the mid 90s, right?
90 to 96.
Okay, right. So, and at this point, you got two of the biggest German companies, Siemens and SAP, right?
Yep.
You happen to fall into Siemens and then ended up doing SAP consulting, which is fascinating to me.
Yep.
But let me ask the question, at the time, looking back on that, given where you are now in supply chain and leadership and everything, looking back on that SAP, was SAP kind of still the early stages of moving towards supply chain? Were they more concrete in their value proposition of being, because they historically have always been sort of a financial planning, kind of sort of morphed into this thing called ERP, and then have sort of, in my own opinion, I don't want to say stopped innovating, because I have a lot of respect for them, but it, you know, like IBM and some of these big companies, they kind of have stagnated to some extent. But I'm curious from your perspective, at that time frame, though, that was kind of an interesting period, because at that point, supply chain wasn't even big. SAP was just trying to get in the United States, because it's got a massive foothold now, obviously, right? Yep. I mean, it's done an amazing job. But did they even realize strategically or tactically that they were sort of pre-positioning for this ERP supply chain stuff?
Not like you and I think of it today.
Right.
For them, supply chain was very much silos of movement of goods and making of goods, right? So production planning and scheduling existed, but if you wanted to go into a more advanced planning environment, you had to custom code that in something like ABAP at the time.
Right. And what about things like, and again, it's a leading question, because it's going to bring full circle to where we are today. Even the concepts that we might now know, and again, to put contextually, this is all of 25 years ago. This isn't that long ago. I mean, this is really actually relatively recent. So, you know, even though people today will pick up and might listen to this, and everyone immediately, like, if they Google supply chain solutions, SAP is all over the place, obviously, right? But they didn't even realize they were a supply chain-esque solution. And I'm going to start to poke some holes in that in a second. But until now, right? And that's all of 20 years of evolution. But things, you know, they financial planning, scheduling, yada, 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 different silos. I mean, what the chief issue most people have as SAP users today is exactly what you're describing, that hasn't changed in 20 years. Siloed, disparate systems that don't talk very well, even within the SAP environment, right? And there was a missing whole concept of digital twins and kind of trying to replicate the actual supply chain process. That was never part of the origination of that platform. They're trying to kind of shoehorn it back in today. Is that a fair sort of?
Yeah, it's interesting, because the truth of the matter is, to your point, you know, SAP was traditional ERP, trying to get different parts of the organization to speak with one another. Right. I would say the industry itself hadn't gone to a place where, you know, thinking of value chains or anything like that yet at all. It was all focused on inside your four walls exclusively. Right. So it was still enterprise software.
To your point, it was still enterprise software. It wasn't even cloudy integration. I mean, it was just
right. No, Richard, when I started, this was a year coming off the mainframe. This is 3.0F. So several versions several iterations into their client server version.
Yeah.
So cloud wasn't even a thought at the time.
Right. Yeah, which is still 20 years ago. I mean, it's just not that long ago, and you and I are pretty damn close to the same age. So I was kind of picking out the mid 90s in there. Okay. So sorry. So let's back to you. So you got this SAP, you clearly are naturally joining talent. So somewhere in there, you started to realize that, oh my gosh, there's an opportunity here for me to start thinking about placing either current or future supply chain leadership.
So one step in between.
Yeah.
So there's one step in between, and that is in 2000. I'm sorry, I got my dates wrong earlier. I started with Siemens in 95. I finished in 2000.
Okay. So mid to late 90s.
95 to 2000. And then I, in 2000, joined AMR Research.
Gotcha.
I actually was listening to another podcast you guys with Stan Arnaud from like a year and a half ago.
Yeah.
So very much resonated with me. I'm sure it sounds like he joined exactly right before I left.
Yeah.
So AMR Research, originally founded as Advanced Manufacturing Research, right? Went there, and it was really exciting because whereas, selling an SAP consulting engagement was like elephant hunting, AMR was very much more, I'll say, the high volume environment, right? I go deal with 200 plus prospects to sell to. So I was selling their supply chain and manufacturing research into discrete manufacturing companies, aerospace defense companies. And the last year when I left, had actually helped them start up a government business, selling their commercial research into the government, which is some awesome stories there. But I'm going to tell you, when it comes to your earlier question about true exposure to supply chain, that's where it really came in.
Gotcha.
The people there, like I've worked with a tremendous amount of really smart individuals. I was not on the research side. I was on the sales side, selling into supply chain professionals, selling into IT professionals. But the exposure that we got there, being in those sessions, every time a new piece of research came out, the analysts were working with the salespeople for 2 or 3 hours to help us understand what it meant, why the audience wants to hear about this, get them to want to engage in it, et cetera, which was just fascinating stuff.
Right. So that's so what was it then? Because you got AMR in there, and again, small world, right? All these thought leaders who are in supply chain have crossed paths in some way, shape, or form, and I'm sure there's many others mixed up in there. Immediately, I think of Newt Alecky, from with his German roots and everything, right? And he's leading all the supply chain, or one of the leaders of the supply chain practice at McKinsey. Co-authored a book with Radu, one of your colleagues, right? Global recruiter out of Singapore. That's coming out anyway. So, what though really triggered you to make the leap into supply chain recruiting, which, if I'm doing my dates right, was somewhere around sort of the 2004, 5, 6 timeframe, which is still kind of early, honestly. What people, supply chain still wasn't sexy. So what did you see that other people weren't seeing?
So supply chain may not have been sexy, but the needs were there. Yeah. I'll tell you, there's 2 things that helped me get into the recruiting piece. One, I'm going to go back to my original mentor that I mentioned. I hope everyone's got a good mentor. My father was in recruiting most of my life. Okay. So from 81 on, he was in recruiting. So although I never worked in this business, I grew up vicariously at the dinner table in that business my whole life, in respect. When my wife and I found out we were having our first child, we decided it was time to get off the road. I loved working for AMR, but it was either driving an hour to Boston or flying to different cities, a couple times a week. So we looked at multiple options to get off the road, but stay in the business I knew and loved, which was selling into supply chain. Tried a couple of different things, including buying a vending machine business and all. But long story made short, when we did a lot of soul searching, we figured out that although I'd never worked in recruiting, knew enough about it, felt I had the best mentor out there to get into recruiting of supply chain. Now, my specialty of supply chain was much different than what my father was in at the time. So I had a great mentor learning recruiting, but I wanted to apply everything I brought from AMR and from Siemens into this world. So I came into this, I'm going to tell you very quickly, very confident that I could be, I was a mid-30 something at the time, that I could be every recruiter to anyone that wanted a recruiter in supply chain. Didn't matter what you wanted. I felt confident that I could talk the talk, I could hold the conversation, and so forth. And At the time, there was 3 distinct areas that we considered, right? A lot of times in recruiting, you find that when somebody comes calling, they often have tried some options on their own first.
Mm-hmm.
So they want results yesterday when they finally agree to come and work together.
Yeah.
So at the time, the consideration was global logistics. Everything was starting to move more and more to China.
Mm-hmm.
Global procurement, same subject, moving to China, and planning.
Mm-hmm.
Right? If you go back to the AMR research days, that whole demand-driven supply network and the hierarchy of supply chain metrics they put together, the toughest part for any company to master, and to this day, it's still atop the list, planning.
Yep.
Specifically demand planning.
Yep.
So for about the first year, we literally took on any global logistics, global procurement, and planning role that we could find.
Gotcha.
To figure out where's the real need inside of businesses. Yes, we can be everything to everybody. Yes, we can hold every conversation. But if you're going to build a network where you become the known entity, you've got to get narrow. You've got to get narrow quickly.
Yep.
We learned that the hard way, right? Because I would take on the search for a global logistics person. It was a brand new search. We didn't have a network. 8 weeks later, you'd come back and someone would say, wow, Jason, you did find the perfect person. But hell, where were you the last 8 weeks? We filled it while you were gone. Right. But yeah, I wished it was this person. I just wish you found him 2 weeks in.
Gotcha.
So we learned the hard way through a lot of those efforts that we needed to get narrow quickly. So over that first year, we narrowed in quickly to the planning space, where I will tell you, now we've expanded quite a bit from those early days. Mm-hmm. But the hardest role for most of those companies to fill turned out to be the planning roles, and that's where we created our specialty.
Well, and that's so. And again, I think you're keying on a couple things in there. One, and I want to double click again on the original question, because I think you're being a bit, you're not giving yourself the credit that maybe in retrospect you deserve, which is you still saw a trend probably 15 years before other people did. Like you could have done recruiting for sales. You could have done recruiting for marketing. You could have done, recruiting is not new, but focusing on supply chain was a bit different. And again, I don't know what your dad/mentor was recruiting for, but I'm pretty sure there wasn't supply chain recruiting in his era, right?
Correct.
So
payment systems.
Yeah, but there was something about you might not have called it supply chain back then, which is also another interesting part of my question here. But I'm still kind of trying to tease out, what did you see in the context of operations and supply chain that were I'm going to go focus here because no one else is doing that. Then you uncovered that the companies wanted planning back then, and I'm gonna follow on that question a little bit. But again, you made a decision to focus in on that area. Why that versus say finance?
Yeah, the easy answer is it's the space I knew. Okay. It was very fragmented. That's the really simple answer.
Chance favors the prepared.
Fragmented. Right. So we have the supply chain or value chain as we know it today. Everyone is speaking the same language, but at the time, logistics worked in silos. Sourcing worked in a silo. Planning worked in a silo. Great inconsistencies across organizations as to where these functions should sit. Mm-hmm. Right? You didn't have a chief supply chain officer. Rarely had a chief supply chain officer back in 2006. Or, God forbid that person should sit at the C-level. Forget about reporting to a CEO. So I gravitated to it first because it's the world I knew. It's the language I spoke. But secondly, where there's chaos, there's problems to be solved. Where there's uncertainty, there's problems to be solved. And as a result of that, this is a solution we could bring to them. We could help bring consistency to the way people thought about this.
Right. Well, again, and threw it out there, but chance favors the prepared. Right. So sometimes it's just lucky being at the right place at the right time. But you were ready. So that's kind of the point of all that. But now, so let me pivot a little bit, because you've been doing this now for about 15, 16 years. You've also, and you're kind of highlighting some things that, again, in me trigger a level setting for the audience, which is we're talking all of 15 years ago. The chief supply chain officer still didn't really exist. The supply chain function was buried 1 or 2 or 3 levels below the C-suite, generally speaking, and it might have been in finance, might have been in operations, might have been God only knows where else, but still kind of tucked down here. Yet it still was complex. It still accounted for the most amount of spend in the company. Yet it still wasn't focused on at the time. So here's my question. now again, looking, and clearly everything, go fast forward to today, supply chains, everything. First of all, what was going on at the time that companies were just not seeing this Leviathan sitting there and wanting to deal with it? And then obviously the pandemic and things like that, but what's changed in 15 years? Like from the corporate perspective, why did it take them 20 or 30 or 40 years to realize supply chain is such a big deal? You know what I mean? Like I'm still kicking myself in the ass going, how has this been this way for so long? I kind of have my own speculations, but I mean, you're right there seeing companies, because you're talking to the companies, like they've shifted their gears. All of a sudden now, fast forward 15 years, you're recruiting for chief supply chain officers, number one, which is new. You're recruiting for supply chain talent that actually reports into the C-suite. That's new. And I bet you're also in the trend in the middle of like CEO positions are actually requesting chief supply chain or supply chain backgrounds to run companies now, a la Tim Cook over at Apple, or others that we can sort of pick off, right? That are supply chain.
Right.
Walmart, exactly.
Walmart.
Yeah, exactly. So again, the question really is, from your perspective, looking back on that, and it's more conversational, but why did it take them this long to figure out this was such a big deal?
I think the first thing was, if you look at the roots of what we call supply chain today, right? The root, I think most people would agree that the roots started with logistics.
Correct.
And logistics historically was a blue collar function.
Yep.
So for what we now know as supply chain to grow from a blue collar function, simply a cost center, keep your costs down, lean manufacturing, lean out the costs, lean out the inefficiencies, all of that stuff, to now a white collar role that is just sitting in corporate. Never mind the C-suite yet. Let's just talk about the fact that it moved to a corporate function.
Right.
That took a tremendous amount of time.
Yep.
Right. I think that was the first challenge there. I just had a conversation with somebody this morning about, you talked about like, how do we get to where we are today? Where we are today and what's happened in the last 2 or 3 years is probably discussion for an entire podcast alone, and the change that it's driven. Right. But, we've moved from, I'll say, very reactionary environments. Everybody's moving to China, back to a cost item. So therefore, I should move my manufacturing to China, as an example, right? So it still stayed very tactical at that level. It wasn't until, I don't know, let's think of the years here. You run from everyone's moving to China to the Great Recession in between. That drove a lot of companies to make big changes, significant changes, right? Richard, it's probably only in the last 8 or 9 years at most now that we have this as a corporate function with one overarching person. And I'm not saying it didn't exist in organizations before that, but now that it's in the norm, now that all organizations are thinking this way, it's in the last 8, 9, 10 years. That's it.
Yeah, correct. Yes. I mean, that newness is also like, again, opportunity.
Yeah.
But I again, because it's so much in your face the last couple of years, certainly the last year and a half, during and then post COVID or whatever pandemic, that people are forgetting that this is literally a relatively new trend, and that you're articulating on right now, right? Yeah. That this whole supply chain thing is even top of mind. Is for as much as it's been in our face for 2 years, it's kind of new.
Yeah. How about one thing we're not talking about here, although we started with ERP, we haven't really talked much about technology's ability to enable what supply chain wants to do.
Correct.
Right. Half of what we're doing, more than half of what we're doing today, and even just in the last couple of years, wasn't possible prior to this, or was ridiculously costly.
Yep. Digital twins, Internet of Things. I mean, all that stuff has gotten to a point now that you can actually deploy it to twin your supply chain. But 10 years ago, no way.
And I'm talking even, I agree with you, yes, but I'm talking even more elementary than that.
Yeah.
So take the value chain. We just did the beer game in our office a month or two ago, right? And we got to see the beer game. So everyone in the office got to see the whole thing, right? Suppliers talking to, customers talking to suppliers, talking across the spectrum.
Yep.
That whole cycle. So speaking outside your four walls, or the concept of seeing one or two tiers deep in all that. As everyone moved offshore, things became more complex. And as a result, it really built, back to your initial question, in my mind, that's really what built up the need for more advancement and everyone speaking together, which brought the supply chain together. And being very elementary here, but to me, that's what brought the supply chain together.
Yeah, elevate it. Well, let's expand on that for a little bit. So now, because your timing was pretty much spot on. You got into and became a global recruiter for all supply chain talent. So you've seen the trends with not only the companies looking to augment, advance, and innovate their supply chains, but also the DNA of the people who are quote unquote supply chain professionals. So the two-part question here is, over the last 10 or 15 years, and you kind of are starting to touch on this, companies have shifted their prioritization towards supply chain. That's a relatively new trend in as far as requirements. So how do you see and articulate that change from when you started to where you are today, the company side, right? Because I'm imagining that's completely different from where you probably struggled to knock on the door and like, hey, I can help you with your supply chain. People are like, what? And nowadays they're like, you probably can't, answer the phone fast enough because people are looking for this. So what's changed in the company's DNA and how they're approaching you from just a recruiting perspective, the company side?
I'm not sure that I understand the question.
So the meaning, like, if these companies 10 or 15 years ago might have said, "Oh, I need a supply chain person," I would need them to focus on demand planning because that was a big problem at the time.
Yeah. But
now companies are coming to you and saying, "Shit, I need a supply chain person that might be the CEO, but I certainly need a chief supply chain officer to run the company. And the DNA is not just demand planning anymore. I need them to help me run my whole business." Right? Like that's how important supply. So the companies have shifted. How they view supply chain. And from your perspective, you have a very unique view of the companies and how they're looking at this stuff. Because it's not like, when I started in supply chain, at eBay, of course, who are the sexy people? It was the developers, of course, because that ran the company. But then sales and marketing were always kind of right there. But supply chain was like literally, like I was lucky to even have a stool in the same room as people from planning. Even though I accounted for most 40% of the expenses, right? Yeah. But that shifted while I was there. And the companies began like, oh, actually, we need you here to be a part of the process and the overall conversation. So you've seen companies shift over 12 years. What is that shift?
So the first thing I would say is back to your example, you represent 40% of the cost. You represent the cost though, right?
Yeah,
so they didn't see you as value generation. That was the problem. And that's the problem that supply chain has had for years.
Yep.
When I first started, it was a very tactical role. It was a tactical title. It was a tactical function. Mm-hmm. It was very much getting into the data, trying to figure out what made sense. Mm-hmm. However, as we joke today, 10, 15 years ago, some of those folks that became what we think of today as corporate supply chain folks were almost like, forgive me if I offend the propeller heads, but it was almost like a propeller head, right?
Yeah, right.
They were doing their analysis, but they didn't know how to present that data to somebody. Right. They didn't know how to use that data to make a business decision, right? The data story that we all talk about today. Fast forward 5 years past that, so now we're going back 7, 8 years ago. Mm-hmm. Companies started to shift and say, we want somebody, rather than having this technical person on one side and a business person on the other side that's going to translate what they're saying, I want that person who's doing the analysis in the room, but I need them to know how to speak sales language over here, finance language over here, keep their technical garbage to themselves. Right. And I don't want to keep, everybody was threatened by the fact or thought that the supply chain person, the technical person was using a black box. They didn't understand how they were coming up with that data, and therefore they completely dismissed it. Right. So the big shift came when they started looking for folks who really had both left brain and right brain characteristics to offer. And therefore they could not only go and do that deep analysis, but now they could go and have that conversation. So rather than sales and marketing, for example, coming into a sales and operations planning meeting and saying, we're going to sell 3x what we've sold in the past, and you acting like an order taker saying, okay, now you can push back and say, you know something, Mr. or Mrs. Sales VP, you've never sold more than 1.2x in the past. What do you know now that you didn't know back then, or that I don't know, that has you believing you're going to sell more than that now? And not only more than that, but 3x that. Yep. I've got the data here to show it. let's talk about this. Oh, you've got a promotion. Well, historically, promotions have done this, have given us like a 15% lift at best. So now they've got the data and they know how to talk to it. And that was a game changer for a lot of these organizations. And what also happened, again, I go back to technology. Technology caught up to the capabilities. So now I didn't necessarily need somebody who could be a VBA programmer using Excel to get at the data. They could use a Manugistics. They could use an I2 at the time. All these tools. Yep. They could use these tools and only had to go and look at exceptions. As long as they knew they had the right model built into it, now all they got to do is go look at the exception, do a little bit of number crunching there. And again, now they become more collaborative. So now they're rubbing elbows with sales, marketing, finance, the executive level inside the organization, collaborating. Whereas in the past, it was a mystery as to what they were doing.
Right. Well,
that was a huge shift.
I was going to say, as you were talking through that, and we've witnessed this, that's sort of how technologists kind of got thrown into the business in the last 25 years. CTOs kind of had to go through that initial cycle of just, oh my God, what are you? I don't understand you. There's a black box there to, oh my God, this is strategic. We got to get you more involved. You got to be part of the business decisioning process, get anything in business or whatever. Like I'm hearing that story, that we just played out with CTO positions, but now we're talking about chief supply chain officers. So in one sense, if I'm going to kind of simplify, companies or enterprises at the time recognize like, oh my God, there's this black box of supply chain. Right. We actually now need someone not only just to run and trust that they can run the black box. They actually have to articulate what that black box is because it's too big for us to avoid anymore. So that's sort of like shift one. But then somewhere also in the last, like you said, 5-6 years, we added more to that chief supply chain officer function, which is now not only do you have to understand supply chain and be someone who can market and sell the ideas of supply chain, but you also have to become a technologist. Because now technology has caught up to you and it is a requirement for you to figure out how to apply technology to this once black box that we know nothing about.
Yep, absolutely.
And so how does that change a little bit as well too, more recently?
So more recently, it's a couple of things have come up. Number one is historically, well, let's go back. Again, organizations have leaned out their supply chains now. Still using all the same skill sets we just talked about. They've got them down, bare bones. They've got costs down. They're having all these strategic discussions. COVID hits, and now they realize they've leaned it out too much. This is all over the news. This is no secret to anyone who's listening to your podcast, right?
Right.
So now the challenge becomes, how do you become more agile?
Right.
How do you become better at mitigating your risk? How do you become better at thinking about your risk? The technology piece is there. The challenge with the technology piece right now is the same fight that supply chain, and frankly, it goes with sales and marketing, I'm sure, or any other function in the organization. The best of breed versus the enterprise tool, and which one's better for your business. So the ability to be savvy in that respect, that hasn't changed whatsoever. In all that. The analytics piece, critical. I'm going to differentiate technologists from analytics because the analytics has become the key. Creating visualization for the business, helping them understand where you can take the business, helping them understand how you can add value to the business, right? Have you seen, the gentleman's name escapes me, forgive me, but have you seen, for example, like what American Eagle is doing with their supply chain, where they're literally saying, hey, we're going to start providing services. If we're sending a truck somewhere that's half full, or we've got a truck coming back empty, why don't we partner with other small to mid-sized retailers? We can't compete with Walmart. We can't compete with Amazon. But why don't we go partner with some of these other smaller, I don't know if they're competitive or non-competitive businesses, but they're saying, let's leverage each other's economies of scale. And now literally bought some technology and digital solutions that they're offering to these other businesses to actually have supply chain be a complete value add to the organization. It's actually fascinating. Check it out afterwards. But I think what's changed now with the supply chain is now the supply chain is having to go back and revisit, how do I add more value? How do I help you sell more? Not just saying, hey, ship this here on time, but how can I make it more attractive to Walmart to want to give me 6 or 12 more inches of space on their shelf? And that's because of supply chain can enable something, not because sales has got a savvy pitch to the organization.
Right. Now, I'm going to come back to that one because you've opened the door for me in another area that I would definitely want to explore a little bit, which is the, again, expanding role of what supply chain is covering, because there's a key other part, which is circularity, which is top of mind right now. I would even contend it's a strategic initiative, not a nice to have environmental kind of initiative, but I'm going to come back to that one in a second. So, but here we are now, you kind of come through this, you're kind of looking at both the company and the companies. I think we've seen it, right? They know they need supply chain leadership. They're looking for it now. They've prioritized. They know it's a key differentiator into the future, right? And now even through the transparency of technology, innovation, and introduction, people are beginning to understand, like, oh my God, the supply chain is massive. Like that infographic I love to show from the National Geographic. I'm sure I showed it to you, but it shows the whole world kind of aggregate supply chain in one big view. And then you see your 100 gigatons of stuff moving through the planet. That's where you get to your 8% circular number. Like just even having that on display, it's no longer, like you put it, a black box, abstract. It's real. This is what it is. This is how I contribute. This is how the $100 trillion global economy functions, right? Which is also validating every investor, innovator, supply chain disruptor right now going, I'm at the right place at the right time doing supply chain stuff, because everyone is now recognizing, holy shit, this is the biggest thing since the internet kind of thing, right? So where I'm looking now is, now thinking in that context, in your role, how are you looking at the future DNA of supply chain leadership? Because doing the same thing over and over again, expecting a different result, well, clearly that doesn't work all that well. So how do you view then kind of the new evolved supply chain leader or leaders? What does that look like going forward?
Yeah, so there's a couple of things. The first is you mentioned the circularity. I'll even say the broader ESG initiatives altogether. Right. The biggest challenge with this right now, I actually spoke with a client about this morning, is there is zero consistency across organizations right now as to where this sits. So the leaders of the future are going to have to literally sit there and say, I want to take ownership of this, because there's a lot of leaders who, I think there's a lot more press release about this right now. And there's good stuff happening for sure. But there's also a lot, I think too many companies are focusing more on the press release than doing good.
No, absolutely.
The leaders of the future, though, I would say it's recognizing that challenge. It's going back to it's recognizing the value that brings back, though. This isn't all philanthropy, right? If you're running out of rare earth materials, one of your other podcasts I listened to said there's more gold coming out of the equipment, I think it was the Dell equipment, than is found in some region of the world, right? This is not philanthropy, but it's supply chain has the opportunity, and the supply chain leadership has the opportunity to go back and say, I can add incremental value here by doing this. And you get a good press release out of it. I think the leaders of the future need to realize, and you'll get a good press release, it's got to be the secondary, not the primary that it is today. That's the big deal there.
And I think, go ahead.
No, that's fine.
I was going to say, because you touch on something that we hear a lot. I love to hear that you're also thinking the same thing, which is, these are not mutually exclusive concepts, but I can lead as a capitalist. It just so happens what I'm doing through circularity, which is actually improving margin, reducing risk. And by the way, it happens to be really good for the environment, right? So it's a business first decision, right? Instead of hey, let's go hug a tree kind of thing, which there's nothing wrong with that, but it it doesn't quite have value to the margin. The board's going to be like, there's no shareholder appreciation here. So what do you do? So then let me, but then and also within this then is the, these leaders have to also, I don't want to say think different. They have to be flexible in their thinking, because there's so much change going on. One of the things that I'm curious about from the perspective, again, the facile nature of the right and left brain executive that you seek out, right? Like they have to come unencumbered, right? Because for me, and I'm kind of leading the witness here a little bit, but every time I hear someone say, this is the way I do stuff, or it's been done this way, like my spidey senses go off in the Richter scale. I'm like, that's my signal for opportunity.
Yeah.
So the leaders you're looking for have to be coming in going, I'm not going to do it the way we've been doing it for 20 years, right? I'm going to try to use the best of what I can, but I'm going to be open to shifting. I'm going to be open to using new technologies. I'm going to be open to shifting, looking at my supply chain. Instead of focusing on procurement, I'm actually going to focus on disposition and circularity on the back end. I'm going to focus on things like asset management, where no one really paid attention to that at all. But I understand that's how I'm going to get down to my digital twinning of everything. So my point here, my question really is, again, how do these people, do you look within the supply chain world? Do you look for disruptors to come in? Like, how do you even recruit for that? Like, how do you look for that?
I would say, you and I talked about this in the pre-show, right?
Yeah.
And we talked about some of the innovators coming from other industries.
Right.
We talked about, the Elon Musks who came from PayPal to SpaceX and Tesla.
Totally.
I was thinking earlier today, you think of like a Lou Gerstner back in IBM days, who came from RJR Reynolds, American Express, to running IBM.
Right.
How does that happen today?
Right.
I think at the executive levels, there's two things here. I think number one, you need those visionary. You need those, I'll say, a visionary personality with a curiosity, but also with the backing of an executive team that's going to give you the leeway, the bandwidth to get to where the organization needs to be. There's absolutely, I'll say, a healthy component of bringing someone in who doesn't come in with a preconceived notion, with a predetermined answer, and is forced to ask the question as to, why do we do it this way? Why, educate me on why that's the right way. What are the other three ways you've considered? What were the results? Not every organization, this comes back to, we're talking, you and I are talking about supply chain executives here, but this is inherent on the board of directors and a CEO to say, you've got the time to go figure this out, which many public organizations don't always have the luxury of time.
Totally.
Right? So that's the biggest challenge. But the innovators, the other challenge is, we've talked about innovation earlier, and that is, it goes without saying, the smaller the business, the easier it's going to be to innovate, right? So many organizations going through, let's say, mergers and acquisitions. Those are great. Those help build up revenues and everything. But instances like that, the chief supply chain officer or the supply chain team is left with cleaning up the mess, right? How many instances have you seen, I'm sure, where, we're going to go put in a new system to make this all one company, and then make it worse. And now you got to bring in a supply chain executive who's all about cleaning up somebody else's mess and not having the ability to innovate.
Right.
This is a rare breed you're talking about, Richard. It's awesome when you have the opportunity to work with them. But I think it'd be unfair to represent that every Fortune 500 company has an innovator as a supply chain executive. It's not the case. But when you meet them, it's amazing.
Yeah, well, I was going to say, but you're also saying, like, even on the innovation side, I don't care if you're in hardcore Silicon Valley these days, even that innovation is just difficult. Innovators are sort of, rare breeds anyways. They can, it's almost like we've, in a way, if the innovation is there, it's like a skill set that can be applied to almost any industry. And Elon Musk is sort of my example in that sense. Like, he's an innovator. If you threw him at education, he would innovate education. If you threw him at space, he'll innovate. You know what I mean? He's just not going to be settling for the status quo. And maybe that's because I've struggled even trying to articulate, like, what the hell does it mean to be an innovator? But there's something about that thinking that we haven't truly kind of psychologically figured out that is a characteristic that you could, take someone and kind of throw them at these problems. It's like a, I don't want to call it like a pinch hitter, but kind of in a way, it's a bad analogy, but So let me bring back then again, kind of, starting to look, we are looking forward a little bit, but how does that play? How do you see this playing out, over, say, this decade here of supply chain? We're in the middle of it. You're kind of recruiting these new people. They're changing things. Even the idea of collaboration, right? Like, we've talked a little bit about enterprises are having to kind of adjust and change quite a bit over the last 20 years, right? They're getting hammered from all sides. And one of the other ones here is, not only do I need you new people coming in to, think a little bit differently, have these innovation characteristics, be technologists at the part-time, but also the idea of collaboration, right? And this is one actually part of the conversation we're having here is trying to collaborate with all these different conversations with people, but that at the enterprise level is not typically their strong suit, and companies that can collaborate better than other companies, i.e. maybe Google as an example, right? Or some of these tech companies that are sort of used to collaboration, or, open source software won, closed source software didn't win, right?
Yep.
Okay, so how does that then apply to this future look at, again, another feature or function of this executive or executives in the role of collaboration?
In my mind, it's all about being able to break down barriers.
Right.
You come from a heavy high tech background, where this is from what I hear you saying is a bit more inherent in the culture, the DNA of a high tech professional.
Yeah.
We do, for example, a tremendous amount of recruiting in the consumer goods industry, right? So any company selling into a Walmart, a Publix, a Best Buy, those, we do a lot of work with those folks. Those retailers, up until a couple of years ago, did not want to share any information whatsoever.
Right.
So the ability to go in and break down a barrier and help them understand where there's value on both sides to us communicating better. You're mad that you've got a stock out. I'm mad that I got to expedite something to fill that stock out. Either way, you lost a sale, right? Help us do this better together. And therefore, let's collaborate. So there's a huge need. And now in the retail industry, it's gotten a lot, retail CPG supply chain, it's gotten a lot better at a cost, right?
Yeah,
retail is happy to say, I'll share that information with you, but it's going to cost you.
Sure, of course.
So the collaboration piece is huge. One thing we haven't talked about here, and if you don't mind, I'm going to skip to this really quickly. And it's not, I don't think it's necessarily innovation to the extent that you're thinking about, but COVID has forced companies to innovate, right? And so I think there's going to be an awesome white paper done, a business case, a Harvard Business Review done in a year or two to talk about what did everybody learn from this, right? It's forced companies to rethink how their supply chains were set up to support their customer base. Things that would have typically taken 5 and 10 years to complete were happening in a matter of months, if not a year.
Right.
If I can give you just a really quick example, I've got one client who's in the food industry, fresh food.
Okay.
Traditionally sold through retail and wholesale channels. This is perishable food that it's got a shelf life of a week at the grocery store. Oh. They went ahead and they started a direct-to-consumer business. No fanfare whatsoever. They just flipped the switch one day in December of 2019. And they said, we're going to work out the kinks. So it's going to be quiet. It's only going to be on our website, no advertising, no nothing. They were averaging 30 orders a day.
Wow.
COVID hits. Overnight, they went to 1,000 orders a day.
Oh.
Inside, their expectation was at $500 million in 5 years. They expected, because of COVID, I never went back and checked, but they were going to hit about 350 million inside the first 12 months.
Oh my God.
So there's an organization that said, we're going to sit here and tap dance to this. We're going to figure out if it doesn't work, nobody's going to know about it. We've been okay. To overnight saying, we need to figure out how to make this to make this a business, because it's great that we're getting all of these orders, but to fulfill them efficiently, to fulfill them at a profit, that's not a given. Right. So that's one small example of many organizations that are going to have been forced to innovate. People who are perhaps weren't ready for that role as chief innovator, who were thrown into that position and had to adapt.
Well, and again, I think it's a great example and a great kind of lead into kind of where things are going over the next few, kind of your megatrends, right? We're kind of winding, and as I always do, I'm looking at the clock now because it's like we're coming up on an hour, and it's like these things fly by, and it's like I wish I had another hour here to go into it, so we'll do it again. But kind of doing the forward look a little bit here. How do you see these megatrends playing out throughout this decade, right? How do you see whether it's the collaborative nature of companies, kind of change? I mean, I feel like there's just so much change that's happening, and it's really at such a fundamental level at the supply chain level now that I'm not even, the future landscape is going to be very different in 2030 than it is today, right? Yep. What do you see in your kind of crystal ball a little bit playing out as supply chain and kind of leading some of that change a little bit right now and taking the kind of forefront?
Yeah, I think a couple of things are going to happen. Number one, I think it's going to happen sooner than that, honestly.
Right.
One thing we haven't talked about, and don't let me steer from your question, one thing we haven't talked about is the challenge in finding talent right now.
Right.
I don't know what the actual number turned out to be, but 10 years ago, MIT put out some information that referenced the fact that by the time the last of the baby boomers retired, there's going to be nearly 80 million retiring, with somewhere between 40 and 60 million people entering the workforce.
Oh, okay.
So the challenge that presents, and the reason I share that with you, the challenge it presents is the fact that historically, the baby boomers are retiring in such large numbers, and organizations are coming back and saying they're losing that whole middle management layer.
Oh,
right?
Wow.
There's not people ready to come up. They're in the time frame companies would prefer. They're not having the time to groom the individuals for those leadership roles, so they're being thrown into it, which is where I come. I feel like you want something more out of my answer, but it's why I keep going back to the technology and the analytics is the most important piece for these folks right now. Aside from the other things we've talked about, the collaboration is key. But this is one of those that to enter the party, you need the technology and the analytics right now, because short of some of the other skills that executives have had in the past, this is the differentiator. The other thing that's key, though, and I'm going to go back to your collaboration topic earlier, communication as a leader is going to be key to getting your workforce to enable what you want to enable. The reason this is a challenge is the whole debate right now. Am I better off working in the office? Am I better off working hybrid? Am I better off working remotely? And there's zero consistency across organizations. And the way that you manage people in those three environments is different. Right? If you and I see each other every day, we can catch up in the hallway for 2 minutes and get an update on something. We don't need to put 15 minutes, 30 minutes, an hour on Zoom. Yet everything in a remote and hybrid environment has become a 15, 30, and 60-minute Zoom call.
Totally.
So on top of that, we go back to the ESG initiatives. You've got all of these workforces. Again, your world is leading this charge. The tech space is leading this charge. Facebook employees revolting, Google employees wanting the executives to take a stance on a certain social initiative and all that. The ability to manage that as a leader, I'm of the opinion that's going to become a key, because again, you have to enable your workforce. You have to enable them to want to do this for you. And the old school way of managing people in that environment is not going to work moving forward.
Right. Well, two really key items, and I hadn't even thought of that, which is the labor shortage associated with the retiring baby boomers and the vacuum that creates, right? Like I hadn't even thought of the pig of the python kind of thing, right? And that literally is the next 5 to 8 years. That is going to be like literally just people falling off the workforce, falling out of the workforce, so to speak. But then also you talk about, and again, another key megatrend here is finding that key ESG, circularity, something, so everyone can speak commonly, right, around what their initiatives are. And I actually do fall back on my previous world of data centers and infrastructure. I've seen this story before. And there we created a metric called PUE, or power utilization efficiency, because there was a vacuum around it. Basically, it was the ESG value for data centers.
Makes sense.
We and a very simple metric. It was just the total amount of power delivered to a data center over the amount of power being used by the servers, which the difference, the delta being wasted energy, right? In air conditioning and infrastructure. Well, I mean, I'm going to be radical. I'll throw it out there. I'll just plant the seed. But I think we need a circularity ratio. If all companies measured how much they're buying that's from virgin materials versus circular materials, keep it that simple. Now, all of a sudden, everyone can report on that. And what it did in the world of data centers is by the minute that common miles per gallon was published, everyone started jumping onto that and wanted to be their marketing department. Like, oh my God, here's a metric finally. I can show my story that I went from a 12, which is where we are today, by the way, at 8% circular, to getting to the nirvana of 1, right? And show that trail and circulate. So I think that's something that's the world needs. But the reason POE worked, though, is because you had an industry that saw the problem and also collaborated. Like that's the point that I wanted to drive home, is that you can't do this as an individual company. I don't think, especially when you're talking about consistent standards. So you have to open up and collaborate with everyone. Otherwise, you're going to have a regulatory environment come in, which is what no one wants.
Agreed.
Right. Agreed. So and I think it's becoming, and it's also one of these things where I think circularity is, again, one of these, almost like supply chain is so obvious how big it is. Circularity is one of those things that's now becoming, I think, a lot of the noise over the last couple of years, the greenwashing, whatever you want to call it, it's kind of giving way to like, okay, let's just focus on whether it's stuff coming out of the ground or stuff that we can reuse. Yeah. Right.
And you and I both know that that's not easy. There's a lot of work involved in that. Yeah. I think of, when I was with AMR Research, I think back to the time when we were doing work with the Department of Defense. Yep. Everyone was, and this is the time when Walmart was trying to define the RFID standards.
Oh, right. Of course.
To get the 100 largest Walmart suppliers, and Walmart Drive is saying, if you want to do business with us, you got to, we need to come together what these standards are, and to see them try to agree on what those standards would be, knowing there's business at risk.
Right. That's impossible.
There's a lot of work. There's a lot of work involved in doing that. So does that mean a standards board's got to come in and make this a reality? Because I don't think, you'll have certain organizations that'll want to lead that charge, but there's always going to be naysayers in that group that's going to make it difficult. Right. So there's a huge opportunity there for sure.
Yep. And to your point, to give credit where credit's due, POE was invented by a third party called the Green Grid. So it was an external organization. Now, of course, there was a lot of debate, and I was in the middle of all of that. And there was everything you're saying, right? Everyone was yelling at each other. But finally it came out, and it ended up being. But regardless, so again, kind of winding down here a little bit. So now you, and again, to put a finer point, networking, availability, obviously you're out here, but I mean, you're completely open to collaborating with people, obviously via LinkedIn. That's how we met. But parting thoughts, things that you're kind of thinking about, or things that your firm's thinking about, or things that you're recruiting for. It sounded like you're in consumer space. And I think about some of the other things that you're probably going to get pulled into. Like I don't have time today. Like, everyone needs supply chain across the spectrum of consumer to business to even venture capital, private equity. Like I can't tell you how many times I'm talking to people who are like, oh, come do venture capital, private equity, because they're still trying to figure out how to invest in supply chain. So it's just like this, there's so much opportunity, especially because you're at the pinnacle of kind of seeing the traffic of the people as they move around, right?
I love it. I tell people I stayed at a Holiday Inn Express last night. I like those commercials, right? I'm that guy that sits there and says, I feel good enough because I hear enough about what's going on that I'm dangerous enough to have these discussions, right? It feels great. I love it. You're on the forefront. You're hearing about things that 6 months, 12 months later, you're actually seeing the story. You're like, I knew about that a year ago. That's really cool. That's what I love about this business. It's really cool.
Got it. That's awesome. Well, listen, again, 60 minutes comes and goes really quickly. I want to thank you again for being on the episode here. It was really a pleasure to chat with you today. Just awesome.
Thanks, Richard. Appreciate the invite.
You got it.
Thanks for listening. If you have any comments about this episode or topics on supply chain you'd like us to cover, you can reach us at supplychainnext@requis.com. And while you're at it, check out the Requis platform at supplychain.requis.com. Requis allows you to manage the full asset lifecycle in the cloud while collaborating with your entire value network to buy, manage, and sell your assets. Find out more at requis.com.